The CEO asked me to lunch, then casually said, "We need to give opportunities to new people now." I'd spent 3 years building our entire tech operation from the ground up, only to be pushed out for the owner's unqualified nephew. His condescending tone made it clear I was disposable. "I understand," I said calmly. They had no idea that We need to give opportunities to new people now. Garrett Morrison didn't even look up from his salmon when he said it. Just kept cutting, that precise corporate motion like he was discussing a budget line item instead of erasing 3 years of my life. I sat across from him at Carlisle's, watching my career end over white tablecloths and overpriced seafood. "Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories that matter. If you believe that competence should matter more than connections in the workplace, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds." The owner's nephew. 28 years old. Fresh from some Silicon Valley boot camp. That's who was replacing me. I'd spent 3 years building Vanguard's entire tech operation from absolute chaos, transforming a failing logistics company into a digital powerhouse that survived when the entire regional power grid went down. I'd worked 18-hour days, missed holidays, sacrificed everything to make their systems unbreakable. And now I was being pushed out for someone whose only qualification was his last name. "I understand," I said calmly, setting down my water glass with steady hands. Garrett looked relieved. He actually looked relieved that I wasn't making a scene. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd seen this coming for 2 months. I'd been watching the server logs, tracing unauthorized access attempts, watching someone systematically download every blueprint, every protocol, every system I'd built from nothing. They weren't just replacing me. They were stealing everything first. And I'd been preparing for this moment since the day I first suspected. The condensation on my water glass formed small rivers that pooled on the white tablecloth. I watched them spread while Garrett continued talking about fresh perspectives and generational evolution. Corporate language designed to make betrayal sound like strategy. He was good at this. Smooth, practiced, probably rehearsed the whole speech in his office mirror this morning. "Marcus Holloway brings a modern perspective," Garrett said, finally meeting my eyes. "He's completed an intensive program at one of the top tech academies in Silicon Valley. Very forward-thinking approach to digital infrastructure." Forward-thinking. That's what they were calling it. Marcus Holloway had spent 3 months learning JavaScript basics while I'd spent 3 years building enterprise systems from scratch. But he had the right last name, the right connections, and apparently that mattered more than actual competence. My mind flashed back to 3 years ago. I'd arrived in Boston broken, running from Minneapolis and Ryan and the ruins of a life I'd thought was solid. My ex-fiancé had been secretly planning a move to Seattle, interviewing for jobs, apartment hunting, building an entire future without me. "I need space to grow," he'd said when I found the apartment listings on his laptop. As if I'd been holding him back instead of supporting every ambition he'd ever mentioned. I'd crashed with my college roommate, sleeping on her couch, rebuilding myself one line of code at a time. Vanguard had been desperate when they found me. A ransomware attack had crippled their entire network. Their previous IT director had quit mid-crisis, leaving them completely exposed with no disaster recovery plan, no backup systems, nothing. They were hemorrhaging money, losing shipments, watching clients flee to competitors who could actually track their inventory. I'd walked into technological disaster and seen possibility. Their logistics operation was running on shared Excel spreadsheets. Password management consisted of sticky notes on monitors. They had no cloud redundancies, no security protocols worth mentioning, no understanding that their entire business was one system failure away from collapse. I'd pitched Garrett a comprehensive 3-year modernization plan. He'd given me a modest budget and told me to work miracles. So I did. For 18 months I practically lived in the office. Rebuilt their network architecture from the foundation up. Implemented cloud redundancies that would keep us running even if the physical servers failed. Trained staff who thought two-factor authentication sounded like science fiction. Created security protocols that made us virtually unhackable. I hired carefully. Marcus Jennings, brilliant with databases who could optimize queries in his sleep. Priya Kapoor, who understood hardware at an instinctive level most engineers never reached. Together we transformed Vanguard from a struggling regional shipping company into a digital operation that clients actually trusted. The real test came last winter during that ice storm. The entire power grid failed across 3 states. Businesses went dark. Supply chains froze. But Vanguard stayed online because I'd designed backup systems and failover protocols for exactly this kind of crisis. I'd spent 72 hours straight in the server room, monitoring everything, making microscopic adjustments, ensuring our clients never knew anything was wrong. The board had noticed. Sent me a formal commendation. Garrett had pulled me aside at the company holiday party, champagne in hand, telling me I was the future of this company. That was 4 months ago. Now he was explaining the transition timeline. We'll need you to document everything over the next 4 weeks. Marcus will shadow you, learn the systems, get up to speed. 4 weeks. 3 years of work reduced to a month of knowledge transfer to someone who probably couldn't explain the difference between a server and a router. Of course, I said. I want to ensure a smooth transition. Garrett's shoulders visibly relaxed. He'd been worried I might resist, might make this difficult. But I was being the perfect professional. Calm, understanding, cooperative. What he couldn't see was the calculation running behind my calm expression. 2 months ago I'd noticed something odd in the server access logs. Late-night login attempts from an IP address I didn't recognize. I'd traced it back to the executive suite. Someone with high-level credentials was accessing systems they had no reason to view. Downloading technical documentation. Copying architecture blueprints. At first I'd thought it was a security breach. Started investigating like I would any potential threat. But then I noticed the pattern. They weren't accessing client data or financial records. They were specifically targeting my work. My custom code, my proprietary solutions, my security frameworks. Someone was preparing to replace me. They just needed to steal everything I knew first. I'd started watching more carefully after that. Noticed how Garrett began canceling our weekly strategy sessions with increasingly transparent excuses. How my access to board meeting agendas mysteriously disappeared from the shared drive. System cleanup, the automated message had said. How a consultant I'd never met showed up asking basic questions about systems I'd designed, claiming senior leadership had authorized his visit. Priya had noticed too. She'd pulled me aside 2 weeks ago, voice low, telling me she'd been invited to planning sessions I knew nothing about. Something feels off, Lil, she'd said. Like they're designing something around you instead of with you. I dismissed her concern then. Still believed that competence mattered more than politics. That building something indispensable made you valued rather than vulnerable. I'd been wrong. Garrett was wrapping up now, signaling for the check. I know this is unexpected, Lillian. But I hope you understand it's not personal. It's just what's best for the company moving forward. Not personal. As if dismantling someone's career could ever be anything but personal. I smiled. Nodded. Shook his hand when he offered it. Warm, slightly damp, held for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to seem sincere, short enough to avoid real connection. I appreciate you telling me directly, I said. He looked genuinely grateful. Probably expected tears or anger or desperate negotiation. Instead he got professional acceptance, which made his job easier and his conscience clearer. I walked through the restaurant with my head up, expression neutral, playing the part of the gracious professional accepting inevitable change. The November rain started halfway to my car. By the time I reached the parking garage I was soaked. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time watching water streak the windshield, thinking about infrastructure. Both the digital kind and the personal kind. How you could build the entire foundation that keeps something running and still become invisible. How irreplaceable was just corporate language for, we haven't figured out how to replace you yet. But they'd figured it out now. Find someone cheaper, someone connected, someone who wouldn't push back when they made stupid decisions. Steal all the knowledge first, then discard the engineer who created it. That evening I went to the office after everyone else had left. The server room hummed with its familiar rhythm. Cooling fans, blinking status lights, the quiet pulse of systems I'd built from nothing. 3 years of my life existed behind these locked doors. Burning the midnight oil? I turned. Marcus Holloway stood in the doorway wearing expensive sneakers and unearned confidence. He looked like he'd walked straight out of a tech startup recruitment video. Designer hoodie, carefully casual, the kind of studied carelessness that only money could buy. Just routine maintenance, I said evenly. Mind if I observe? Getting familiar with the setup. He walked in without waiting for permission. Garrett mentioned you'd be training me over the next few weeks. Of course. He studied the server racks like someone evaluating furniture. Impressive setup. Seems a bit over-engineered for what we actually need, but definitely solid infrastructure. Over-engineered. I'd built these systems to handle triple our current capacity specifically so Vanguard could scale without hitting infrastructure bottlenecks. Every redundancy, every backup system, every layer of complexity he was casually dismissing had a strategic purpose. But he couldn't see that. Didn't have the experience to understand why complexity sometimes equaled resilience. Been reviewing your documentation, he continued. Really thorough. I've got some ideas for streamlining things, modernizing the approach. He said it like he was doing me a favor. Like optimization meant stripping away safeguards without understanding why those safeguards existed in the first place. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, I said. After he left, I sat down at my workstation and pulled up the access logs on my personal laptop, the one they hadn't thought to restrict yet. Marcus Holloway's credentials had been created 5 weeks ago. 5 weeks before my termination lunch. He'd been given full administrator privileges from day one. The viewing history showed he'd already downloaded my entire technical documentation library. Every custom solution, every proprietary algorithm, every workaround that made impossible timelines routine. They'd been planning this for months. Mining my knowledge while I worked 18-hour days fixing security vulnerabilities, while I sacrificed evenings and weekends to keep their systems running flawlessly. While I was building their future, they were systematically preparing to erase mine. I pulled out my phone and texted Marcus Jennings, "Coffee tomorrow? Harbor Cay. 6:30. Then I drove to the pier where Ryan and I used to watch container ships navigate the harbor. Back when I still believed people meant what they promised. Back when I thought commitment was something more than convenient until it wasn't. The water was black under the November sky, reflecting nothing. I sat in my car, engine off, watching my breath fog the windows. I thought about trust and value and what happens when you mistake being essential for being secure. About the difference between building something and owning it. About how easily competence becomes invisible until the moment everything breaks. They thought I was disposable. Thought I'd accept this quietly and fade away. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Marcus Jennings was already at Harbor Cafe when I arrived at dawn, hunched over a coffee that looked like it had gone cold. Exhaustion was written in every line of his face. The kind that comes from losing sleep over moral dilemmas instead of technical problems. "They're phasing you out," he said before I'd even sat down. "I know." I slid into the booth across from him. "How long have you known?" "Few weeks." He couldn't meet my eyes. "They've been having me document your systems. Asking strange questions about dependencies, vulnerabilities, failover procedures. Making me explain architecture only you fully understand." He finally looked up. "I should have warned you immediately. I'm sorry." "You have twins," I said quietly. "Middle school, right? And a mortgage." He nodded. "Student loans. Another 8 years of payments." I understood. Principal was expensive when you had obligations. When refusing to cooperate meant risking everything your family depended on. Marcus had made the calculation every parent makes. Protect your own first, even when it means compromising what you know is right. We sat in silence for a moment, watching early morning joggers pass the window, their breath visible in the November cold. A delivery truck rumbled past. The barista called out someone's order. Normal life continuing while mine was being systematically dismantled. I leaned forward. "They think everything's captured in the documentation." Understanding flickered across Marcus's face. "But we both know it's not," I continued quietly. "The proprietary middleware I'd developed independently. The custom integrations that existed nowhere in official code repositories. The monitoring algorithms that only functioned because of invisible architecture they couldn't see or replicate. The patches I'd built during late nights and weekends, solutions to problems that weren't supposed to be solvable. I'm not sabotaging anything," I said carefully. "But I'm not giving away what belongs to me either." Marcus studied me for a long moment. "Then, what do you need?" "Copies of everything I developed independently. Original code, timestamps, anything that proves ownership separate from Vanguard's standard work product." I paused. "And I need to know who's still with me." He pulled a flash drive from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. Already done. Everything you asked for. I pulled it last night after everyone left. I looked at the small device. You're risking your job. They're going to do this to all of us eventually, he said. Today it's you. Tomorrow it's me or Priya or anyone who knows too much and costs too much. He wrapped his hands around his cold coffee. I can't teach my daughters to stand up to bullies and then be a coward myself. The official announcement came during the company-wide meeting the following week. I'd spent the days between strategizing with a lawyer, documenting everything, preparing for what I knew was coming. But preparation didn't make it hurt less. Garrett stood at the podium with Marcus Holloway beside him like a crown prince being presented to the kingdom. The conference room was packed. They'd made attendance mandatory. As many of you know, Vanguard is entering an exciting new phase, Garrett began, his voice carrying that practiced corporate enthusiasm. We're committed to generational transition and fresh perspectives that will carry us into the future. Fresh perspectives. Code for cheaper labor and nepotism. Lillian Thorne has been instrumental in building our technology infrastructure, he continued, carefully not meeting my eyes. We're grateful for her contributions as she helps transition leadership to Marcus over the next 4 weeks. Past tense. I was already gone in his mind. Whispers rippled through the room. Most of my team looked genuinely shocked. They hadn't known. Priya's head snapped toward me from across the conference room, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. I gave her the smallest nod. Later. Marcus Holloway stepped forward, all youth and confidence. I'm excited to build on the strong foundation Lillian created, he said, managing to make it sound both complimentary and dismissive. We'll be implementing some modern approaches to streamline operations and position Vanguard for scalable growth. He had no idea what any of those words actually meant in practice. After the meeting, I requested an immediate private conversation with Garrett and Sharon from HR. They tried to put me off, but I stood my ground. We ended up in a small conference room, the 3 of us around a table that felt like an interrogation setup. Several of the critical systems Marcus will be inheriting were built using my personal development framework, I said without preamble. Created outside standard work hours, based on proprietary code I developed before joining Vanguard. Sharon slid paperwork across the table. She'd been ready for this. Your employment contract is explicit, Lillian. All work product created during your tenure belongs to Vanguard. Not everything, I countered. The CoreSync platform was developed 6 months before I joined this company. I licensed it to Vanguard but retained ownership. It's documented in the original integration agreement from 3 years ago. Garrett shifted in his chair, the first crack in his corporate composure. That was 3 years ago, Lillian. Circumstances have evolved. So has CoreSync, I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. Every update, every enhancement, every integration was built on my original architecture. I'm not being difficult. I'm requesting fair compensation for my intellectual property. Garrett and Sharon exchanged glances, the look of people realizing they'd miscalculated something important. We'll review this, Garrett said finally, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. Meanwhile, please focus on knowledge transfer with Marcus. I recognized that tone. Bureaucratic stalling. They were buying time to build a legal strategy that would bury me in technicalities. Sure enough, the next morning I found my access to development servers had been restricted. An automated notification claimed it was security protocol during transitions. 20 minutes later, I discovered Marcus Holloway had called a team meeting without including me. I showed up anyway. He was mid-sentence when I walked in, standing at the whiteboard with a marker, discussing changes to the network architecture. His irritation was visible for just a moment before he masked it with forced politeness. Lillian, great timing. I was just discussing some architectural improvements. Interesting, I said, leaning against the doorframe. Which architecture specifically? The warehouse management system. We're going to simplify the data flow, remove some of the unnecessary complexity. Those data flows prevent inventory discrepancies during peak shipping periods, I said evenly. They're calibrated specifically for our scanning equipment and real-time sync requirements. Marcus's smile tightened. Modern systems don't require such complicated workarounds. They're not workarounds, Priya interjected, her voice sharp. They're necessary adaptations for our specific hardware configuration. Lillian designed them after the system failure in early 2023 that cost us $200,000 in lost shipments and nearly killed the Meridian contract. The room fell silent. Several team members nodded, remembering that disaster. Marcus turned back to the whiteboard, effectively dismissing both of us. Well, I appreciate the context, but we're moving forward with the simplification. That afternoon, I received an email from legal. Subject line: Intellectual Property Clarification. The message asserted Vanguard's complete ownership of all systems, including CoreSync, citing a clause about integrated technologies becoming company property through sustained use and enhancement. They offered me a technology acquisition bonus of $3,000. $3,000. For 3 years of work that had transformed their entire operation. It was an insult disguised as generosity. But the real betrayal came later that evening. Marcus Jennings called while I was driving home. He's doing individual meetings, Marcus said, his voice tight. Marcus Holloway. Scheduled performance discussions with everyone on the team. Not transition meetings, evaluations. He's deciding who to keep. When's yours? Tomorrow morning. Priya's is this afternoon. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. What did he ask her? If your systems were actually necessary or just unnecessarily complex. Whether the team could operate more efficiently with simplified architecture. He's building a case, Lil. Looking for ammunition to justify whatever changes he wants to make. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment going through emails on my personal account, the one Vanguard couldn't monitor. That's when I found it. A message from one of our software vendors, confused about a licensing transfer they'd received from Vanguard. The attached agreement made my blood run cold. Garrett had signed a contract reassigning all my custom integrations to a third-party platform. The company name was vaguely familiar, so I looked it up. A startup founded 18 months ago by 2 MIT graduates. One of them had the same last name as Marcus Holloway. They weren't just removing me. They were dismantling everything I'd created and monetizing it, selling off pieces of my work to enrich themselves and their connections. My custom supplier integrations, the automated inventory reconciliation system, the predictive analytics for warehouse optimization. All of it being transferred to a company that would charge Vanguard licensing fees for using technology I'd built. I sat there in the dark of my apartment, laptop screen the only light, understanding finally crystallizing into something cold and sharp. This had never been about fresh perspectives or generational transition. It had always been about money. About extracting maximum value from my work while minimizing what they had to pay me for it. They'd planned this for months. Maybe longer. And they'd thought I wouldn't figure it out until it was too late to fight back. I needed proof of ownership. Concrete, undeniable evidence that CoreSync belonged to me before Vanguard ever existed. The next morning, I tried accessing the backup servers where I'd stored my original development files. Code I'd written 6 months before joining the company, documentation that proved the timeline of creation. My credentials were denied. I tried again, thinking maybe I'd mistyped the password. Same result. They'd revoked my access to everything. Even the work that legally belonged to me. I sat there staring at the error message, feeling something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just corporate maneuvering anymore. This was deliberate obstruction. They were trying to make it impossible for me to prove what was mine. That evening, I pulled up an old contact in my phone. Elena Martinez. We'd met at a tech conference in Austin 2 years ago. Ended up having drinks after a panel discussion about intellectual property protection in the digital age. She was a cybersecurity attorney who specialized in cases exactly like mine. Developers whose work got appropriated by the companies they worked for. We'd stayed loosely in touch. Occasional emails about industry news. Congratulations when she won a major case last year. Now I needed her expertise in ways I'd never anticipated. I texted her, "Need legal advice. Urgent. Can we meet?" Her response came within minutes. "Tomorrow evening? Brookline. Angelo's on Harvard Street. 7 p.m. Angelo's was perfect. A quiet Italian place far from downtown Boston where Vanguard employees would never think to look. I arrived early, chose a corner booth with a view of the entrance, ordered water I didn't drink. Elena arrived exactly on time, her briefcase suggesting she'd come straight from the office. She slid into the booth, ordered wine and got straight to business. "Tell me everything." So I did. The termination lunch. The unqualified nephew replacing me. The stolen integrations being sold to his roommate's startup. The credential revocations. The systematic downloading of my proprietary code. I laid it out methodically the way I'd present a technical problem. Symptoms, timeline, evidence. Elena took notes on her tablet, occasionally stopping me to ask clarifying questions. When I finished, she sat back and studied me. Legally, you're in a difficult position, she said carefully. Work-for-hire doctrine gives employers broad rights to anything created during employment. But, she held up a hand as I started to protest, something doesn't add up here. Why terminate you now? The company's thriving specifically because of what you built. They've got stable operations, satisfied clients, systems that work. Why risk disrupting all that? I can't figure it out either, I admitted. It doesn't make business sense. Unless the business is changing in ways you don't know about. Elena tapped her tablet. Let me do some research. Public records, SEC filings, corporate registrations. Nothing invasive, just information that should be publicly available anyway. Sometimes the answer isn't in what companies do, it's in what they're preparing to become. We parted ways with a plan. She'd dig into Vanguard's corporate filings while I continued documenting everything I could remember about CoreSync's development timeline. I drove home through evening traffic, my mind circling the same questions. Why no? Why this way? What was I missing? 3 days later, my phone rang at midnight. Elena's name on the screen. You need to see this, she said without preamble. Her voice carried controlled anger, the kind lawyers develop when they found something that offends their sense of justice. I'm sending you files now. Look at them and call me back. The documents appeared in my email seconds later. SEC filings. Corporate disclosures. Acquisition agreements in late-stage negotiation. Vanguard was being acquired by Meridian Logistics, a national supply chain corporation worth billions. The deal was contingent on Vanguard demonstrating modernized technical infrastructure and sustainable leadership transition. My hands started shaking as I read further. They're positioning for sale, Elena explained when I called back. Your systems are a major asset in the valuation. The filings specifically reference proprietary logistics management platform with advanced real-time tracking capabilities. That's your CoreSync, Lillian. They're selling your work as their primary asset. But why push me out before the sale? I asked. Wouldn't I add value to the deal? Read attachment 3, Elena said grimly. I opened it. Internal emails obtained through discovery procedures. Public record because Meridian was a publicly traded company and had filed preliminary acquisition documents. The first email was from David Holloway to Garrett, dated 4 months ago. Meridian's concerned about key personnel dependencies. Want to see leadership transition before finalizing terms. Suggest we begin phase out of current tech director, position Marcus as new generation leadership. 4 months ago. While I'd been working 18-hour days resolving a critical security vulnerability that could have cost them millions. The next email was Garrett's response. Agreed. We'll begin documentation extraction and transition planning. Marcus Holloway starts shadowing systems immediately. Another email dated 3 months ago. Lillian's work product must be secured before termination. Legal reviewing ownership claims on CoreSync platform. May need to accelerate timeline if she becomes aware of acquisition. They'd been planning this for months. Extracting my knowledge, copying my code, preparing Marcus to take credit for systems he couldn't build himself. All timed to maximize the acquisition value while minimizing my ability to claim what was mine. While I was building their future, they were systematically erasing me from it. I drove to Castle Island without consciously deciding to go there. Parked in the lot overlooking the harbor and sat watching planes descend toward Logan Airport, their lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. My mind cycled through every conversation from the past 4 months. The consultant who'd shown up asking basic questions. He'd been from Meridian doing due diligence. My disappeared board access. They'd been discussing the acquisition in those meetings. Garrett canceling our weekly sessions. He couldn't meet my eyes while planning my removal. Every subtle shift in tone, every odd interaction, every unexplained change, it had all been choreographed. A carefully planned extraction of knowledge before disposing of the source. I thought about Ryan planning his Seattle move in secret. building a future without me while pretending we had one together. Making me believe in something that was already ending. But this time was different. This time I wasn't the person who'd fallen apart. This time I'd seen it coming. I'd been watching, documenting, preparing. At home, I tore through my closet looking for an old external hard drive I'd used before joining Vanguard. Found it in a box of cables and adapters I'd nearly thrown away during my last apartment move. I plugged it in with shaking hands. The files were still there. Original CoreSync code, dated 8 months before I'd joined Vanguard. Development notes showing the evolution of the platform. Architecture diagrams I'd sketched during coffee shop sessions while job hunting after Ryan left. And emails. Dozens of emails. Including one from Garrett Morrison, dated 3 weeks after I'd started at Vanguard. Your CoreSync platform is exactly what we need. Can you integrate it with our current systems? We'll discuss proper licensing arrangements once the initial crisis is resolved. Another 2 months later, CoreSync working beautifully. You've saved this company, Lillian. We'll formalize the licensing agreement when things stabilize. I trusted those promises. Believed when things stabilize was a real timeline instead of indefinite delay. Fool me once. The next morning, Marcus Holloway called me into a conference room. Garrett and Sharon were already there, their expressions carefully neutral. We're accelerating the timeline, Garrett announced without preamble. Your last day will be next Friday. 1 week instead of 4. They were panicking, though I wasn't sure they fully understood why yet. Marcus has demonstrated exceptional capability, Sharon said smoothly. And frankly, Lillian, your attitude hasn't facilitated a productive transition. Classic HR language. Blame the victim. Create documentation justifying the termination in case of legal challenges. Marcus Holloway leaned forward with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. We'll need all documentation and training completed by Wednesday. I want to ensure continuity for the team. The team he was planning to evaluate and potentially replace. I nodded slowly, then asked with perfect calm, and regarding CoreSync ownership? Have you reviewed the original agreements? Garrett's expression hardened into something almost hostile. Our legal team has determined all integrated systems are company property. The separation package is generous, Lillian. I suggest you accept it. I stood, gathered my things with deliberate slowness. I'll have my attorney review everything, I said quietly. Garrett leaned forward, his voice carrying an edge of warning. Don't complicate this. It won't change the outcome. I met his eyes directly. We'll see. As I walked out, I pulled out my phone and texted Marcus Jennings, Plan B, tonight. His response was immediate. Where and when? They thought they'd won. Thought they'd covered every angle, secured every asset, eliminated every risk. They had no idea what was coming. Marcus Jennings texted back an address. A grocery store parking lot in Newton, far enough from Vanguard territory that we wouldn't be seen. 6 hours later, I pulled into the lot just as dusk was settling over the suburbs. His car was already there, parked near the back by the shopping cart return. I pulled up beside him and he got out, glancing around nervously before approaching my passenger window. I unlocked the door and he slid in, bringing cold air and tension with him. He handed me a flash drive without a word. Everything you asked for, he said quietly. Original code bases with your development signatures. Deployment logs showing implementation dates. Authentication keys. System dependencies. Even the admin backdoors we built for emergency access that aren't documented anywhere official. I turned the small device over in my hand. You could lose everything for this. I know. His jaw was tight. Couldn't sleep last night. Kept thinking about what I'd tell my daughters if they asked me what I did when I saw something wrong happening. You have a family to protect, I said. I understand if. That's exactly why I'm doing this. He cut me off, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. Because they think we're all disposable. Today it's you. Tomorrow it's me or Priya or anyone else who knows too much and costs too much. He looked at me directly. I have kids, Lillian. I can't teach them to stand up to bullies and then be a coward myself. We sat there in the darkening parking lot, our breath fogging the windows, and I felt something shift. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been erased after building something valuable. Every engineer who'd watched their work get monetized while they got discarded. Thank you, I said and meant it more than he could know. What's your plan? He asked. Right now. Prove ownership. Build leverage. Make them realize what they're actually losing. I paused. I'm not trying to destroy the company. Just protect what's mine. He nodded then hesitated. Well, there's something else. Marcus Holloway asked me to stay late tomorrow to help him understand the CoreSync architecture. He wants to know if there are any dependencies that could cause system failures. What did you tell him? That I'd need to review the documentation. A slight smile crossed his face. Which, of course, doesn't include half the critical components because you built them independently. After he left, I drove home and didn't leave my apartment for the entire weekend. I set up my dining table like a war room. Laptop, external monitors, the flash drive Marcus had given me, printed copies of every email I'd saved, legal pads covered in timelines and notes. Elena came over Saturday morning with coffee and pastries and her own laptop, and we worked through the evidence piece by piece. Start with the original CoreSync code, she instructed. We need timestamps proving you created it before Vanguard. I pulled up the files from my old hard drive. Creation dates, modification history, even the metadata showing which computer I'd used. My personal laptop, not company equipment. Now the emails, Elena continued. Specifically ones where Garrett acknowledges this was your platform, not company property. I found them easily. The email where he'd first asked me to integrate CoreSync into Vanguard systems. Another where he'd written your platform is saving us during the ransomware crisis. A third where he'd promised to formalize the licensing arrangement when things stabilize. This is good, Elena said, making notes. They're going to argue integration. That once you incorporated CoreSync into their systems, it became inseparable from company property. We need to prove the core functionality can exist independently. Sunday morning I started building exactly that. An independent version of CoreSync that could operate completely separate from Vanguard's infrastructure. I used the original code from my hard drive, stripped away the Vanguard-specific integrations, and rebuilt it as a standalone platform. It took 14 hours straight. By Sunday evening I had a working prototype that could track inventory, manage logistics, and provide real-time analytics without touching any of Vanguard's systems. Proof that CoreSync existed independently of their infrastructure. Now we need to establish your ownership formally, Elena said, reviewing my work. File provisional patents on the key innovations. Not the whole platform, just the specific technical solutions that make it unique. We identified 3 critical components: the load balancing algorithm that prevented crashes during peak shipping periods, the predictive analytics that anticipated warehouse bottlenecks before they happened, and the mobile interface architecture that worked offline then synced seamlessly when connection was restored. These weren't generic solutions. They were specific innovations I'd created through trial and error, late nights debugging, and deep understanding of logistics operations that you couldn't learn from a boot camp. Elena helped me draft the patent applications while I ate cold pizza and drank my 4th cup of coffee. By midnight Sunday we'd filed provisional patents on all 3 innovations. Now comes the important part, Elena said, closing her laptop. You need a failsafe. Something that protects your work without destroying the company or hurting innocent employees. I'd been thinking about this for days. A licensing requirement. Built into the code itself. Explain. I update CoreSync with digital signature verification. The system checks if it's being run under a valid license from me. If not, it triggers a graceful shutdown with clear instructions for renewing the license. Elena considered this. Timeline. The license expires 9 days from now. 2 days after my official termination date. So if they sign a proper licensing agreement, everything continues working? Exactly. Nothing destructive. Nothing malicious. Just standard software licensing that they should have established 3 years ago. Elena smiled slightly. That's actually brilliant. You're not sabotaging anything, you're just requiring them to pay for what they're using. I spent the rest of the night implementing the changes. Working with the code Marcus Jennings had provided, I carefully updated the authentication protocols. Added the license verification. Set the expiration date. Tested everything multiple times to ensure it would work as intended. A clean shutdown that protected data integrity while making it impossible to continue operations without proper licensing. By 2 a.m. it was done. I transferred all my original code to an encrypted cloud server Elena had helped me set up, completely separate from anything Vanguard could access. Monday morning I arrived at the office early, exhausted but clear-headed. Priya was already at her desk and she looked worse than I felt. Marcus called emergency sessions all weekend, she said quietly as I approached. Tried to reverse engineer your monitoring algorithms. How'd that go? Badly. 4 shipping alerts got missed Saturday morning. We had to ground operations at the Framingham warehouse for 6 hours. She rubbed her eyes. Lost about 60,000 in delayed shipments. 2 clients called demanding explanations. I kept my expression carefully neutral, but internally I was documenting every detail. The systems were already failing without proper understanding. Marcus Holloway's arrogance was costing them real money. That's unfortunate, I said simply. Priya hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Well, I think I'm next. Marcus keeps asking if my position is mission critical. Like he's building justification to cut anyone who worked closely with you. I looked at her directly. Do you trust me? He didn't hesitate. Completely. I pulled a sealed envelope from my bag and slid it across her desk. If anything unusual happens this week, anything at all, open this. It explains everything. She took the envelope, held it for a moment, then tucked it carefully into her bag. What are you planning? I'm planning to make sure we all get what we're worth, I said. That afternoon, while Marcus Holloway was in meetings discussing my transition plan, I made the final updates to CoreSync's licensing protocol. The changes were subtle, buried deep in authentication routines that no one would think to examine unless they knew exactly what to look for. The license would expire in exactly 9 days. And when it did, every instance of CoreSync across all of Vanguard's operations would display a simple message. License expired. Contact developer to renew service. Nothing malicious. Nothing destructive. Just the natural consequence of using something that didn't belong to them without permission from the person who created it. I saved the changes, encrypted the backup and logged out. For the first time in weeks I felt something close to calm. They thought they'd covered every angle. Thought they'd secured every asset and eliminated every threat. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Thursday morning, Marcus Holloway appeared at my desk without warning. Can I see you in my office? It wasn't really a question. I followed him down the hallway, past cubicles where my former team carefully avoided making eye contact. His office, formerly a storage room before they'd cleared it out for him, still smelled like cardboard and old carpet. He closed the door and gestured to a chair. I remained standing. Some team members mentioned you've been acting unusual this week, he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. Anything I should know about? I gave him my calmest smile, the one I'd perfected over 3 years of dealing with executives who consistently underestimated me. Just ensuring everything's properly documented. You'll want comprehensive records for the transition. He studied me with belated suspicion, like someone who just realized they might have missed something important but couldn't quite identify what. His fingers drummed on the desk. A nervous tell. We're changing all system credentials tomorrow after you leave, he said, trying to inject authority into his tone. Standard security protocol. Makes sense, I replied with a nod. So there won't be any issues? With access or functionality? It won't affect CoreSync's core functionality, I said evenly. He leaned forward. Meaning what exactly? I kept my voice professionally neutral, helpful even. Just that the platform is designed to operate independently of admin credentials. That's part of the elegance of the architecture. No single point of failure. You can change passwords all day and the core systems will continue functioning. Marcus chose to interpret this as reassurance rather than the carefully worded truth it actually was. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Great, he said, already moving papers around on his desk in dismissal. HR will handle your exit paperwork tomorrow morning. 9 am. That evening I texted Marcus Jennings and Priya. Drinks? Cambridge. The Plough and Stars. 7. The bar was perfect. Dim lighting far enough from Vanguard territory that we'd never see anyone from the office. I arrived first, chose a corner table with a view of the entrance. Ordered a beer I had no intention of drinking. Marcus arrived next, looking worn down in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Priya came 10 minutes later, her expression carefully neutral until she spotted us and something in her face cracked. We sat in silence for a moment. The bar hummed with Thursday night energy. College students, young professionals, people whose jobs weren't imploding around them. My wife asked what was wrong last night, Marcus finally said, staring at his beer. I told her about everything. About you, about what they're doing. What did she say? Priya asked. She said good people don't let good people get destroyed without fighting back. He looked up at me. Then she asked what I was doing about it. Priya nodded slowly. My daughter asked why I seemed sad lately. She's 15, notices everything. I told her someone at work was being treated unfairly. She paused. She said, so why aren't you doing something about it? The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. Whatever happens next week, I said carefully, I want you both to know you don't owe me anything. You have families, careers, futures to protect. I never asked you to risk any of that. Marcus shook his head. We're not protecting you, Lil. We're protecting the idea that people who build things should own what they create. That competence should matter more than connections. And we're protecting ourselves, Priya added quietly. Because if they can do this to you, someone who literally saved the company, they can do it to anyone. We're all disposable to them. We talked for another hour, carefully avoiding specifics, never explicitly discussing what might happen but understanding passing between us in the spaces between words. When we finally left, Marcus pulled me aside in the parking lot. The system audit they're running tomorrow, he said quietly. They're looking for backdoors, anything they think you might have left that could give you access after termination. Will they find anything? Not what they're looking for. A slight smile crossed his face. Because you didn't leave backdoors. You just never gave them the whole picture to begin with. Friday morning arrived with gray skies and temperatures that promised winter was done being polite about its arrival. I dressed carefully, professional but not corporate, someone leaving on her own terms rather than being pushed out. The HR meeting was exactly as soulless as I'd expected. Sharon from HR slid paperwork across the table with practiced efficiency. Termination acknowledgement, non-disclosure agreement, liability waivers that tried to prevent me from ever speaking about my departure. Elena Martinez already reviewed these, I said, pulling out my own copies with her annotations in red ink. I'll sign the termination acknowledgement. The NDA is acceptable with the modifications noted. I won't sign the additional liability waivers. They're overly broad and not part of my original employment contract. Sharon's pleasant expression faltered. These are standard. They're not standard and they're not enforceable. My attorney was very clear about that. We went back and forth for 20 minutes before Sharon finally agreed to remove the additional waivers. I signed what was necessary, declined what wasn't, and handed back the pen. Your access badge? Sharon prompted. I slid it across the table. 3 years reduced to a piece of plastic with an increasingly outdated photo. Marcus Holloway organized a farewell lunch, Sharon continued. 1 o'clock at. I'll pass but thank you. Her lips tightened. It would be good for team morale. Show there are no hard feelings. I'm sure Marcus can handle team morale without me. I walked out of HR, down the hallway past the conference room where I'd presented my 3-year modernization plan, past the server room where I'd spent countless late nights, past the break room where the team used to gather to celebrate project completions. My car was parked in visitor parking now. They'd revoked my assigned spot 2 days ago. As I reached it, my phone rang. Marcus Jennings. It's done, he said without preamble. His voice was tense, almost breathless. Marcus just reset all the admin passwords. Changed every credential in the system. They're running a complete audit this afternoon, going through every line of access logs, looking for anything they think you might have left behind. I leaned against my car, feeling the cold metal through my jacket. The November wind cut across the parking lot. Thanks for letting me know, I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. What happens now? He asked, and the question carried weight beyond mere curiosity. He was really asking, did we do enough? Is this going to work? What comes next? Now we wait, I told him. Now we see if they're smart enough to realize what they actually lost. I spent the weekend doing deliberately, aggressively normal things. Grocery shopping on Saturday morning, pushing a cart through aisles while other shoppers complained about produce prices and debated between pasta brands. Laundry in the basement of my apartment building, folding clothes while a neighbor's kid ran circles around the dryers. Reading a mystery novel I'd been meaning to finish for 3 months, finally getting through it in one sitting. Sunday afternoon I called my mother in Minneapolis. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying that particular brightness she used when she was gardening. "Lillian, I was just thinking about you. The mums are still hanging on, can you believe it? This late in November." I let her talk about her garden, about the neighbors, about her book club's latest selection. She didn't ask about work. I'd told her months ago that everything was going well, that I was happy, that Boston had been the right choice after all. No reason to complicate that story now. Phone calls from unknown numbers came throughout the weekend. I ignored them all. Let them go to voicemail. Didn't bother checking the messages. Saturday evening, I stood on my small balcony watching the harbor lights come on across the water. The city looked beautiful from this distance. All glowing windows and reflected light, the ugliness of individual struggles invisible from here. I thought about infrastructure. Not the digital kind but the personal kind. The foundation you build in yourself that determines whether you collapse or stand firm when everything external crumbles. When Ryan left, I'd nearly fallen apart because I'd built my entire sense of self on being chosen. Being loved. Being enough for someone else. I'd measured my worth by his presence in my life. This time was different. This time I knew exactly what I was worth, regardless of whether Vanguard chose to acknowledge it. I'd built something real, something valuable, something that couldn't be replicated by someone with 3 months of training and the right last name. Sunday night, I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed the timeline one final time. The license would expire Monday morning at 9:42 a.m., exactly when warehouse operations shifted to peak volume, exactly when CoreSync became most critical to their entire operation. I'd chosen the timing carefully. Not vindictive, just strategic. They needed to understand what they were losing at the moment when that loss mattered most. I set my alarm for 9 a.m., poured a glass of wine, and stood at my kitchen window watching the city lights blur into abstract patterns. Tomorrow would tell me if I'd been clever or just desperate. Tomorrow would show whether justice was something you could code into a system or just a story we told ourselves while powerful people did whatever they wanted. I finished the wine, rinsed the glass, and went to bed. Slept better than I had in months. Monday morning my alarm went off at 9 a.m. I made coffee, opened my laptop at the kitchen table, and pulled up the monitoring dashboard I'd set up on my secure server. The screen showed all 3 Vanguard facilities, green status indicators across the board. Everything running normally. For now. I watched the clock in the corner of the screen. 9:38. 9:39. 9:40. At exactly 9:42 a.m., when warehouse operations shifted to peak volume and CoreSync became most critical to their entire workflow, the status indicators started changing. Yellow. Then orange. Then red. Every instance of CoreSync across Vanguard's entire operation displayed the same notification. License expired. Contact developer to renew service. The message was professional, calm, utterly factual. I'd written it that way deliberately. No anger, no accusations, just a simple statement of reality. I'd set up the monitoring not to gloat, but to ensure the systems shut down cleanly without data corruption or safety issues. The shutdown sequence I'd programmed was graceful. All active transactions completed, all data saved properly, everything logged correctly. Nothing damaged. Nothing lost. Just stopped. By 9:50 the first warehouse had ground operations to a halt. Scanners couldn't communicate with the central system. Forklift operators couldn't access inventory locations. Shipping manifests couldn't be generated. By 10:15, all 3 facilities were offline. I watched the cascade through system logs, feeling oddly detached. This wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, burning someone's life down out of anger. This was simply the natural consequence of trying to use something you don't own without permission from the person who created it. My phone started ringing. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Different unknown number. Voicemail. And again. They could wait. They'd made me wait through months of secret planning and systematic erasure. They could wait through a few hours of consequences. At 10:47 a text from Marcus Jennings. All hell breaking loose here. Marcus H. running between facilities. Garrett locked in conference room with lawyers. No one knows what to do. I didn't respond. Just watch the monitoring dashboard, watch the system stay stubbornly offline, watch the time tick forward. At 11:03 my phone rang again. This time I recognized the number. Garrett's personal cell, still saved in my contacts from 3 years of working closely together. I let it ring 4 times before answering. What the hell did you do? His voice carried panic barely masked by attempted authority. In the background I could hear multiple voices, phones ringing, the chaos of a crisis unfolding in real time. I kept my voice calm, almost pleasant. Good morning, Garrett. Don't play games, Lillian. Our entire operation is down. You did something to the systems. I didn't do anything, I said evenly. The software license expired. As the developer and owner of CoreSync, I'm happy to discuss renewal terms. Stunned silence. Then, this is sabotage. I almost laughed at the audacity. This is standard license management. You might want to review the original integration agreement from 3 years ago. Section 4 explicitly states that Vanguard was licensing the technology, not acquiring it. The license term was tied to my active employment plus a reasonable transition period. We had 4 weeks. You accelerated the timeline to 1 week. Remember? Last Friday was my final day. The transition period ended at close of business. The license expired this morning. I could hear voices in the background getting louder. Someone saying, check the contract, and another voice saying, where's the legal team? I've sent a licensing proposal to your legal department, I continued. The terms are straightforward. Acknowledgement of my ownership, appropriate compensation for continued use, and a confidentiality agreement regarding my departure circumstances. Garrett's voice went cold. This is extortion. I let the silence hang for a moment before responding. This is business, Garrett. I understand. These things happen. I hung up. My hands were shaking slightly as I set the phone down. Not from fear or anger but from adrenaline. From the reality that I'd actually done it. I made more coffee I didn't drink and watched my email inbox fill up. 11:07 a.m. Sharon from HR subject line. Urgent system access issue. 11:14 a.m. David Holloway himself. Need to discuss CoreSync situation immediately. 11:23 a.m. An attorney I didn't recognize. Vanguard Systems licensing dispute. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead I called Elena. It's happening, I told her. I saw the news. Vanguard's stock dropped 2% in the last hour. Someone leaked that they're having operational issues. Her voice carried satisfaction. How are you holding up? Surprisingly calm. Good. Let them panic for a few hours. Let them fully understand what they've lost. When they realize their entire acquisition deal is at risk, they'll be much more reasonable. What if they try to get an injunction? Force me to restore service. On what grounds? You own the software. You licensed it to them. The license expired. That's not illegal, it's basic contract law. She paused. Plus, you left them a clear path to restore service. All they have to do is acknowledge your ownership and agree to fair compensation. After we hung up, I did something deliberately, almost aggressively normal. I went for a walk. The November day was cold and bright, the kind of weather that makes everything look sharp-edged and clear. I walked along the harbor, past joggers and dog walkers and people having their lunch on benches overlooking the water. At a small cafe, I ordered a sandwich I barely tasted and sat by the window watching people pass. A mother with a stroller. An elderly couple holding hands. A businessman shouting into his phone about delayed shipments. Living my life while theirs fell apart. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply the space I needed to remain calm and clear-headed for what came next. At a corner market, I bought flowers, bright orange chrysanthemums that reminded me of fall in Minnesota, of better times before everything got complicated. By the time I got home at 3 p.m., I had 17 missed calls and 23 new emails. At 4:15, Elena called again. Their attorneys reviewed your documentation, she said. They've admitted you have a legitimate ownership claim. But they're arguing that the integration makes separation impossible. That CoreSync is so embedded in their operations that removing it would cause irreparable harm. They're threatening to seek an injunction, arguing that your actions constitute economic sabotage. I'd been expecting this. Remind them that I offered a fair licensing agreement before my termination. That Garrett refused to negotiate. That they proceeded to lock me out of my own intellectual property and tried to transfer it to Marcus Holloway's roommate's company. Already did. Also reminded them that we have documentation of every step. Email trails showing they knew CoreSync was your property. Proof they systematically extracted your knowledge while planning your termination. Evidence of the acquisition deal that motivated everything. And they're worried about publicity. If this goes to court, the acquisition falls apart. Meridian won't buy a company embroiled in intellectual property litigation. Pause. They're asking for an emergency meeting. Tonight. They want to settle. I looked at the chrysanthemums now sitting in a vase on my kitchen counter, their bright orange petals catching the late afternoon light. Something settled inside me. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and more sustainable. Tell them I'll consider meeting tomorrow, I said. After they've spent a full day living with the consequences. You sure? They're desperate right now. That's our leverage. I'm sure. They made decisions for months without consulting me. They can wait one day. Elena's approval was evident in her voice. I'll let them know. That evening, as the sun set over the harbor and the city lights began their nightly routine, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Jennings. Emergency meeting just ended. Marcus Holloway looked like he was going to cry. Kept saying the documentation didn't show any of this. Garrett asked him at least 5 times why he didn't know about the licensing requirements. Marcus couldn't answer. David Holloway asked who reviewed the acquisition due diligence. No one had a good answer for that either. It was brutal. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied. Vindicated. Triumphant. But what I actually felt was tired. And clear. And certain that what I'd done was necessary. I didn't respond to Marcus's text, but I saved it. Then I poured a glass of wine, stood at my kitchen window, and watched the city lights blur into abstract patterns while somewhere across town, executives who'd thought I was disposable were learning exactly how wrong they'd been. Tuesday morning I woke up knowing exactly what I was worth. I dressed carefully, charcoal blazer, simple blouse, professional but not supplicant. Successful but not flashy. The kind of outfit that said I didn't need their approval but understood how these games were played. Elena picked me up at 9:30. We drove downtown in silence, both of us running through the strategy we'd refined over the past 24 hours. The meeting was at a neutral location, a conference room in Hammond and Price, a law office that neither of us had connections to. Neutral territory for what was essentially a hostage negotiation, except I was the one holding the leverage. We arrived at 10 a.m. exactly. Not early enough to seem desperate, not late enough to seem petty. Garrett was already there, looking like he hadn't slept. David Holloway sat beside him, fingers drumming on the table, the same nervous tell I'd seen in his nephew. Sharon from HR occupied the far end, her expression professionally neutral. 2 lawyers I didn't recognize flanked them, both with the exhausted look of people who'd spent the night reviewing contracts and finding nothing but bad news. Marcus Holloway was notably absent. They were already distancing themselves from their golden boy. We took our seats across the table. Elena arranged her laptop and files with deliberate precision. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Garrett started to speak, but one of the lawyers, older, gray-haired, expensive suit, cut him off with a raised hand. Miss Thorne, the lawyer said, his voice carrying practiced neutrality. We acknowledge there may have been some misunderstanding regarding the ownership structure of the CoreSync platform. Elena didn't let that stand for even a second. There was no misunderstanding, she said crisply. There was a deliberate attempt to appropriate my client's intellectual property without compensation. We have documentation proving ownership, emails acknowledging the licensing arrangement, and evidence of systematic extraction of proprietary information. She opened her laptop and turned it so they could see the screen. Timeline of events, email chains, access logs. What we have here is not a misunderstanding, Elena continued. It's theft. The word hung in the air like smoke. David Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was the majority shareholder, the one whose nephew had triggered this entire disaster. I watched him calculate in real time how much this was going to cost. Not just in money but in reputation, in the acquisition deal that was supposed to set him up for a comfortable retirement. Let's not use inflammatory language, the gray-haired lawyer said. Let's use accurate language, Elena countered. She pulled up another document. My client developed CoreSync 6 months before joining Vanguard. She licensed it to the company with explicit retention of ownership rights. This was acknowledged by Mr. Morrison in multiple emails. She gestured to the screen. These emails where he refers to licensing Lillian's platform and promises to formalize arrangements once things stabilize. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The negotiation took 4 hours. They tried everything. The younger lawyer argued that work-for-hire doctrine superseded the licensing agreement. Elena produced the employment contract with its carve-out clause for pre-existing intellectual property. Sharon suggested that the integration of CoreSync into Vanguard's systems created shared ownership. Elena showed timestamps proving the core functionality existed independently, demonstrated with the standalone version I'd built over the weekend. The gray-haired lawyer implied that my actions, the license expiration, constituted breach of contract and economic sabotage. Elena calmly explained that enforcing licensing terms was standard business practice, and that I'd offered to negotiate a proper agreement before my termination, which Vanguard had refused. They had nothing but assumptions and corporate overreach. Elena had documentation, evidence, and the law on her side. Around 2 p.m. someone ordered sandwiches that no one ate. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Finally, David Holloway leaned forward, cutting off his lawyer's mid-argument. What do you want? I'd been waiting for this question, preparing for it since the moment I'd watched those server logs 2 months ago. First, I said, my voice steady and clear, immediate acknowledgement of my ownership of CoreSync and all derivative works. Documentation stating clearly that the platform was developed independently and licensed to Vanguard, not created as work for hire. David nodded slowly. Continue. Second, a licensing agreement with appropriate compensation. 15% of the acquisition value attributed to the logistics platform. Payable over 3 years with standard payment guarantees. The lawyers exchanged glances. 15% of CoreSync's valuation in the Meridian acquisition was substantial, somewhere in the range of several $millions. Third, I continued, a confidentiality agreement that prevents Vanguard from disparaging my work or the circumstances of my departure. Any reference to my employment ends with mutual agreement to part ways. And fourth, Garrett's voice was tight, restoration of my professional reputation. A formal statement from Vanguard acknowledging my contributions to the company's technical infrastructure and expressing gratitude for my service. Silence around the table. Then Elena added quietly, the alternative is litigation that will take years, cost millions in legal fees, and almost certainly kill your acquisition deal. Meridian won't wait while you sort out disputed intellectual property ownership. And given the documentation we have, publicity around this case won't reflect well on Vanguard's business practices. David Holloway's face had gone pale. We need to discuss this privately. Of course, Elena said. They filed out. Elena and I moved to a different conference room down the hall. Someone brought fresh coffee that went cold while we waited. How are you feeling? Elena asked after 20 minutes of silence. Tired, I admitted. But clear. They're going to agree. They have no choice. I know. 45 minutes later they returned. Garrett spoke first and I could see how much the words cost him. We agree to your terms. David Holloway added quickly, with one addition. We need you available as a consultant during the transition. To ensure system stability and support the integration with Meridian. I looked at Elena. We'd anticipated this request. Consulting rate is triple my previous salary, I said. And I work on my own schedule, reporting to Meridian's chief technology officer, not to Vanguard management. David's eyes widened slightly at the rate, but he nodded. Agreed. The lawyers pulled out laptops and started drafting documentation immediately. It took another 2 hours to finalize everything, every clause reviewed and negotiated, every term precisely defined. I read every word carefully before signing. Elena reviewed it twice. When the last signature was in place, Garrett stood and extended his hand. I looked at it for a moment before shaking it. His palm was damp. You planned this all along, didn't you? He said quietly as we gathered our things. The license expiration time to your departure? I met his eyes directly. I planned to protect what was mine. You planned to steal it. One of us succeeded. He looked away first. As Elena and I walked down the hallway toward the elevators, I saw Marcus Holloway standing near the windows, phone pressed to his ear, his voice urgent and strained. He looked up as we passed. The phone dropped slightly from his ear. Our eyes met for just a moment. I didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Just gave him a slight nod and kept walking. Let him live with the knowledge that his arrogance had cost his family's company millions. That the easy job he'd been handed had turned into a disaster because he'd underestimated someone he'd never bothered to understand. Outside, the November air was cold and sharp. Elena and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not speaking. You did it, she finally said. We did it, I corrected. She smiled. Drinks tonight? We should celebrate. Tomorrow, I said. Tonight I just want to go home and sleep. But there was one more meeting first. 4 days later I sat in a very different conference room. Meridian Logistics' downtown office was all glass and steel and expensive minimalism. Cassandra Wells, their chief technology officer, was in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of my favorite engineering professor in college. He got straight to the point. We're proceeding with the Vanguard acquisition, she said, sliding a contract across the table. But we want you leading the technical integration as an independent consultant. Not an employee. Not tied to Vanguard's management structure. You report directly to me. I reviewed the contract. The compensation was 3 times my previous Vanguard salary. Complete autonomy over schedule and methodology. Defined scope that protected me from overreach. What about Marcus Holloway? I asked. Cassandra's expression cooled noticeably. Mr. Holloway will be pursuing other opportunities. His technical assessments during our due diligence were optimistic at best. He assured his uncle that the transition would be seamless. He paused meaningfully. Obviously it wasn't. She leaned back in her chair. Between us, this acquisition nearly fell apart. If you hadn't been willing to negotiate, we would have walked away. Vanguard doesn't seem to understand that they bet their entire future on systems you built. Systems that apparently can't function without you. I signed the contract that afternoon. And for the first time in months I felt something like peace. Not because I'd hurt anyone, but because I'd finally been properly valued for what I'd created. I left Cassandra's office and walked through downtown Boston as the afternoon light turned golden. The contract was in my bag, signed and sealed. The peace I felt wasn't triumph. It was something quieter. Resolution maybe. Or just the simple satisfaction of being properly valued. 3 weeks later, my phone rang while I was reviewing system architecture plans for the Meridian integration. Marcus Jennings. Marcus Holloway is gone, he said without preamble. I set down my coffee. When? They announced it this morning. Official line is, pursuing other opportunities. He paused. Want to know what actually happened? Tell me. 2 major clients threatened to terminate their contracts after repeated system failures. The logistics platform crashed twice last week during peak shipping periods. Packages lost, delivery windows missed, inventory counts completely wrong. His voice carried an edge of dark satisfaction. Meridian sent in their own tech team to assess the damage. Found out Marcus had been trying to streamline your architecture. Removed what he called redundant protocols. The load balancing algorithms, I said quietly. And the failover systems. And half the error checking. Basically everything that kept the platform stable under pressure. Marcus let out a long breath. He didn't understand why the complexity existed. Thought he was optimizing when he was actually dismantling the only things keeping everything from collapsing. I should have felt vindicated. Should have felt satisfaction that his arrogance had caught up with him. Instead I just felt tired. Marcus Holloway was a symptom, I said. Not the disease. What do you mean? The disease is a system that values credentials over competence. Connections over contribution. That treats expertise as disposable until the moment everything breaks. I watched pedestrians pass on the street below. He was just a kid who got handed something he wasn't ready for. The real problem is the people who handed it to him. Speaking of which, Marcus said, Garrett's still technically CO through the acquisition. But his role at Meridian is essentially decorative now. Impressive title, corner office, but he doesn't make actual decisions anymore. Sits in meetings and nods while other people talk. How's he taking it? Not well. He's aged about 10 years in the past month. After we hung up, I stood at my window for a long time, thinking about consequences and accountability and whether any of this had actually changed anything fundamental about how the world worked. Probably not. But maybe it had changed something about how I worked within it. 2 weeks later, Marcus Jennings called again. This time with a question. I'm thinking about leaving Vanguard, he said. And I wondered if you might have space in your consulting practice. I'd been expecting this. What about your job security? Your family? My wife and I talked about it. A lot. He paused. She said watching me compromise what I believe in was harder than any financial uncertainty would be. And she's right. I can't keep working for people who treat competence as disposable. When can you start? Within 4 months, both Marcus and Priya had joined me. We weren't employer and employees. We structured it as a partnership. Equal stakes, shared decision-making, everyone properly compensated for what they contributed. Priya brought 3 other former Vanguard engineers with her. People who'd watched what happened to me and decided they wanted to work somewhere that valued them properly. We rented office space in Cambridge. Nothing fancy, just 2 rooms with good light and a view of the river. Filled it with whiteboards and comfortable chairs and the kind of equipment we'd always wanted but never gotten approved at Vanguard. My first consulting payment from Meridian was substantial. I used it for a down payment on a brownstone apartment in the North End. 1 bedroom, exposed brick, a small balcony overlooking the harbor. Not extravagant. Just mine. I furnished it slowly, deliberately. A couch I actually liked instead of something on sale. Art from local galleries. Bookshelves I filled with technical manuals and novels in equal measure. In the window box on my balcony, I planted descendants of those orange chrysanthemums I'd bought myself during the worst of it. A small reminder that sometimes you buy yourself flowers and build yourself a life while everything around you is falling apart. Unlike with Ryan, where I tried to build a home around someone else's vision of what our life should be, this space was entirely mine. Every choice reflected what I wanted, what I valued, who I was becoming. Almost a year after that lunch at Carlyle's, I attended a technology conference at the Boston Convention Center. Industry people, vendors, engineers comparing notes on emerging technologies. I was standing in the reception hall during a break when I saw him. Garrett Morrison across the room near the windows. He looked older. The past year hadn't been kind. His suit was expensive but hung differently on him, like he'd lost weight. The confidence I remembered had been replaced by something more cautious. He started to turn away when he spotted me. Then stopped. Seemed to make a decision. Approached my table. Lillian. Garrett. He stood there awkwardly for a moment. You won. I looked at him, really looked. The exhaustion around his eyes. The defeat in his posture. The way his hands fidgeted with his conference badge. He'd aged years and months. It wasn't about winning, I said finally. It was about knowing what I'm worth. He nodded slowly. I should have seen that. Should have valued it. He glanced out the window at the city skyline. We destroyed something good because David wanted to give his nephew a chance and I was too focused on the acquisition to push back on bad judgment. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer than I'd expected. You made choices, I said quietly. We all did. Yeah. He looked back at me. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not for the acquisition. That was always going to happen. But for how we handled it. For not being honest with you. For treating you like you were disposable when you'd built everything that mattered. Thank you for saying that. He nodded once more, then walked away. I stayed there for a long time watching the city lights come on across the harbor, thinking about systems. The ones we build, the ones we break, and the ones that ultimately define who we are. 6 months after that encounter, my consulting firm had expanded to 15 people. We operated differently than most tech companies. No venture capital, no pressure to grow faster than made sense. We were selective about clients, turning down projects that wanted to extract our expertise without properly compensating us. We only accepted contracts where we maintained ownership of our innovations, where we got fair recognition, where the terms respected what we brought to the table. Marcus Jennings's daughters visited the office one afternoon after school. They were 12 now, identical twins who looked around our workspace with wide eyes. The younger one, Sarah, approached me while her dad was showing her sister the server setup. "Is this the place my dad talks about?" she asked. "Where people treat each other right?" I looked at her earnest expression, at the hope in the question. "Yes," I said. "This is that place." "Cool." She paused. "He says you taught him it's okay to stand up for what's right even when it's scary." Across the room, Marcus's eyes had gotten bright. He looked away quickly, but I'd seen it. We weren't changing the whole industry. We were too small for that, too new, too focused on sustainable growth instead of explosive scaling. But we were proving something important. That competence has value. That creators deserve ownership. That you can build success without treating people as disposable parts in someone else's machine. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something they can't function without, then making them acknowledge they needed you all along. I thought about that lunch at Carlisle's. Garrett's casual dismissal. My own calm acceptance that hid months of careful preparation. They thought I was disposable. They learned otherwise. And in learning that lesson, they taught me something too. I'm not just worth what others decide to pay me. I'm worth what I know I created. What I can build. What I bring to any table I choose to sit at. That knowledge, more than any contract, more than any settlement, more than any revenge, is what I built from the ruins. On Friday evenings now, I stand on my balcony watching the sun set over the harbor. The chrysanthemums bloom orange against the railing. The city spreads out below, full of people building and breaking and rebuilding their lives. I pour wine. Watch the light change. Think about infrastructure and resilience and the foundations that matter. And I know with absolute certainty exactly what I'm worth. Not because someone finally acknowledged it, but because I never forgot it in the first place. If this story of calculated justice had you hooked from start to finish, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when that license expired at exactly 9:42 a.m. and Lillian watched their entire operation crash in real time. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.